Welcome, everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. We invite for you to connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media and to please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays to tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this conversation. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we'd love for you to introduce yourself using the chat box at the bottom of the screen. In addition, all attendees are welcome to use the Q&A box to post any questions they may have during the conversation. We'll dedicate some time towards the end of the conversation to respond to those questions. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording, as well as any slides and resources shared during the presentation, will be shared in a follow-up email to all webinar registrants. Finally, we invite for you to take the brief on-screen evaluation poll that will pop up both in the beginning and at the closing of this webinar. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. Finally, before we start, I'd like to call your attention to our upcoming webinars. We hope you'll come back to join us next week for our session co-sponsored with Education Week to discuss how school districts can benefit from public housing partnerships. The following week, on Tuesday, November 29th at 3 p.m., we return to our series in partnership with New America, focused on kindergarten transition, with an exploration of the key combination of teaching strategies to optimize learning in the kindergarten classroom. We'll be sure to add registration and links in the chat box for more information, and we hope you can join us. Joining you now is John Gomperts, Executive Fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you, Sierra, as always. And welcome to everyone. I'm so glad you're here today. I'm going to make just a couple of quick opening remarks, and then I want to get into this. I am so excited about today's session, and I have three reasons why I'm so excited. Number one is, as you will see in just a moment, we have amazing guests with us today, and I think we're all in a great spot for learning a lot today. Number two, the topic today really asks us to look differently at a bunch of the questions that we're always asking in these sessions. And what I mean by that is, instead of starting with an intervention and how an intervention works forward to create what we sometimes call the optimal conditions for learning, we are actually going to start at the end. We're going to ask ourselves, and we're going to learn what puts a young person, a student, in the best position to absorb new information and to develop in the ways we'd like them to develop. And then the third reason I'm excited about this is by taking that other lens on the whole question of learning and optimal conditions for learning, it actually invites us to think about ourselves. Like, when are we in the optimal position for learning something new, for doing something different? And when we think about what puts us in that best position, then we can think, oh, interesting. We would like to put kids in that best position. Then we work backwards to sort of, what are the building blocks for that? And then we will go back one step further from that and think, okay, well, what interventions or what actions would you take that support those building blocks, which in turn produces that end state, which puts a person, in this case, a young person, a student, in the optimal position for learning. That's our inquiry today. And I want to start by introducing our guests. You will see, Sierra, you want to put up the screen with our guests. First, we're joined by Maryam Abdullah, who's Parenting Program Director for the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley. She's going to kick us off. And then we're going to be joined by Iheoma Iruka, who is the founding director of Equity Research Action Coalition and a faculty fellow at UNC Chapel and a returnee to the grade level reading campaign. And then by my old and great friend, Karen Pittman, who also has been with all of us before and has been thinking about these questions for a long time. That will be our quote unquote expert panel. And then, Sierra, you want to flip to the next screen? We'll be joined by 3 community leaders who have been working on these issues closely and have a lot to offer about what's going on. Kate Knudsen, who's the facilitator of the Metro-Omaha Raise Me to Read campaign. And then we have Beth Tomlinson, who's the senior director of education and the co-founder of Resilient Lehigh Valley, which is part of the United Way of Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania. And then Liz Woody-Remington, who's the co-founder and director of professional development for the Learning Alliance in Indian River, Florida. So we have a great geographic spread. We have fantastic folks. Now you see on your screen, we're going to get to these guys in just a sec, but you see on your screen that we're starting with a poll. And as I said, part of this exercise is to invite us to think about like what puts us as adults or quasi-adults, however we think about ourselves, in the best position for learning. What are the conditions that we like about learning? When you finish that question, there are 4 more quick questions. So I want to give everybody just a second to go through these questions and get answers. What we're trying to do is get your input, which will in turn shape the nature of this conversation and help each of us think about what it is we mean when we talk about optimal conditions for learning and what defines our own well-being that puts us in place to learn. So Sierra, you want to flip to do people flip themselves to the next question or do we flip this?
Yes, if you can just scroll down, they'll all be there.
Just scroll down. So you see one on your screen. Yeah, well, some people are seeing this. We're getting our votes. Okay, you're better at this than I am. Fantastic, fantastic. I want to give everybody maybe 30 seconds more to, there you go, Emily, thank you for that reminder to people. Let's do like 30 seconds more and take a quick look at the results. And then I'm going to invite Maryam to join us, Maryam Abdullah to join us. We have 68%. 68% of the vote is counted, as if we didn't, some of us watched those vote percentages go up just a week ago, right? So now we're watching it in our own little lives. We're at 74%. We'll go for another 20 seconds and then we'll look at our results. We'll have whichever news organization you watch will call the election here. Okay, great. Thank you all. And we get our results live right here. So if we look at this first, what's the most important contributor to your well-being? Supportive relationships is pretty clearly the most important, but then being engaged and interested in my activities, feeling competent and capable. Interesting, feeling optimistic about the future gets fewer votes. I wonder if that would have been different if that had been higher up on the poll. We're not that scientific that we randomly assign them to different people. And feeling that people respect me was the lowest ranking. Now, we then queried, because this is part of really what we want to talk about today, do you think your schools and communities are doing enough to support the well-being of students? 7% said yes, 7%. That's worrisome. More than 60% said no, right? Don't know was also 30%. How about for parents and caregivers? So more 7% yes for students, and what are we looking at here? 23% for parents, although still 44% said no. And look at this for educators. Only 20% said that we're doing enough to support the well-being of educators. And again, 44% said no. Right? Or actually here with educators, I'm sorry, 51% said no. And then we asked, and we're going to get into this, what would be most helpful if we agree with this proposition that well-being is fundamental to learning, then how, and we'd like to pursue this, what kind of resources would be most helpful? So thank you very much. I guess if you just punch the thing in the upper left-hand corner, we're going to make this disappear. And we're going to be on screen. And Maryam, can you join us on screen now? Thanks so much. Thank you. So Maryam Abdullah from the Greater Good Science Center at the University of California at Berkeley. Help us out, please. Help us. Before we get, I know you have the building blocks. I want to get to those in a sec. But before we even get to the building blocks, can you give me and everybody a definition of what you mean when you say well-being? What are the, what is it, what's the, not what are the building blocks, but what's the sense inside a human being that we would call well-being?
Yes. Well, first off, John, I want to thank you and the team at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading for organizing this conversation. And this topic of well-being is near and dear to my heart, and I'm thankful to be able to chat with you all about it today.
I'm so glad.
Yeah.
We're glad to have you.
So my understanding from the science of well-being is that it is generally, it's an overall evaluation of how you think your life is, how satisfied, and how worthwhile you think it is. And, this is often best answered from a person's own perspective, just like the poll that you offered earlier, where folks were able to state what was most important to them. And 39% said supportive relationships. And I would say that the research certainly can offer plenty of evidence for the importance of supportive relationships for our well-being.
Awesome. So you want to go on to sort of talk about what's on this slide around the keys to well-being?
Of course, yes.
That'd be
I'd be
great.
happy
Thank
to.
you.
So researchers have used questionnaires for years to study well-being. And since 2001, the Greater Good Science Center, which is my professional home for the past 5 years, has been studying the psychology, the sociology, the neuroscience of well-being, and teaching skills that foster a thriving, resilient, and compassionate society. That's our center's mission. And our focus is on social and emotional well-being specifically. And of course, there are other aspects like physical, environmental, economic well-being. And as we saw, while definitions about well-being can vary from person to person and across cultures, what we've learned from this science is that there are key building blocks to social and emotional well-being that continue to emerge from the research. And you can see there are 12 keys to well-being that we write about at the Greater Good Science Center, and we create content and resources for the public about. And these keys support overall health and foster positive connections with other people, and they help promote human flourishing. And I'd love it for our Zoom attendees to note in the chat, what are 1 to 2 keys to well-being that are on this slide that resonates most for them today? And as you're doing that, I'll lift up a few of them that are important for this conversation about well-being, learning, and literacy. So, for example, we have altruism. That's when we act to promote someone else's welfare, even at a risk or a cost to ourselves. And this is a quality, obviously, that's manifested by educators and parents when they're in the presence of children. I see folks putting in the chat gratitude and purpose. So gratitude, according to the research, has 2 parts. First, that we affirm that there are good things in the world, that there's gifts and benefits that we've received. And second, that we recognize that the sources of this goodness are outside of ourselves, and that others have given us gifts to help us achieve goodness in our lives. I saw someone include compassion. Compassion literally means to suffer together. And it's the feeling that arises when you're confronted with another person's suffering and you feel motivated to relieve that suffering. And importantly, I'll say, and this can be turned inward, which is often very much needed. Self-compassion means that you're recognizing when you are suffering and you need tenderness yourself. I see another person indicated purpose, and purpose is also very important. It's an abiding intention to achieve a long-term goal that's both personally meaningful and makes a positive mark on the world. And that goal, the goals that foster a sense of purpose are ones that could potentially change the lives of other people, like teaching a child to read.
Wow. This is great. And I love the answer. Somebody asked if you could repeat your answer on what constitutes gratitude.
Of course. So 2 key components to gratitude. First, that we affirm that there are good things in the world. So gifts and benefits that we've received. And number 2, that we recognize that the sources of this goodness are outside of ourselves, that others have given us gifts to help us achieve the goodness in our lives.
Yeah, somebody just wrote blessings received and given. Yeah. And I'm going to ask Iheoma and Karen to join in just a second. What are the enemies of well-being?
Yeah.
What's competing here with well-being?
Well, I'd say that clearly well-being is key to a conversation on learning and is key, especially particularly at this time and juncture after the pandemic.
Yeah.
So being in a distressed state, that can be from a sense of loneliness, a sense of being othered, a sense of meaninglessness, a sense of disconnection. That's not a state in which we learn best or educate best. And how is it possible to draw out the capacity of learners before us when we ourselves are overwhelmed or depleted?
Yeah.
As someone who's professionally focused on lifting up parents, this is a question that I contend with all the time. So
Yeah.
I'd say, these states of distress are the enemy of well-being.
Yeah, it's interesting. Somebody just put in the chat about this sense of not being in control of your own destiny, feeling like you're at the peril of other people or other forces. And I can really imagine that. And I can imagine, I mean, we imagine it as adults, and I can especially imagine it as a young person. We hear so much. To me, it's refreshing and enlightening to talk about well-being, because we've heard so much very serious stuff about mental health crisis right now, throughout this whole chain of students, families, teachers, educators, including teachers, but including others in the lives of young people. And to me, I have some gratitude that we're talking about the well-being side of it rather than just problematizing this. Let's have Iheoma and Karen join the conversation. I'd love to get you all. So you guys joining, you coming on screen? Yeah. Awesome. Great. Thank you. Welcome. It's nice to see both of you. I'm so glad that we're having this conversation. I know these are things that you all have thought a lot about over time. So it's great to have your input. I'm curious if you have any initial reactions. Oh, there's no one mentions acceptance. I think we're about to get there. We're about to get there, Imani. I'm curious for some, what's his name? Malcolm Gladwell would call blink reactions to what Maryam just had on the screen, both her definition of well-being and the keys to well-being. You want to kick us off?
Sure. I just want to also say thank you so much, John, and the campaign for grade level reading for having me here. Again,
Oh, we're
coming out of-
happy. We're happy. You're doing us a favor. We're
No, very
good.
glad. No, very glad. Again, Iheoma Iruka, my pronouns are she, her, hers. And so, I mean, I really appreciated hearing Maryam just talk about sort of what well-being means. And I really agree with a lot of those terms that I think were presented and sort of some of the things that impacted. What I would say is I do a lot of work in early childhood, particularly in the early years, really focused on Black children and other racially minoritized children. And for me, well-being is a lot of what's on the screen there. But I will also sort of elevate a few things with, for children, when you're growing up in this country as a young person, the issue of race and racism is it may not be visible to all, but it's present in where you live. It's present in your schooling, whether in early care education and childcare. It's present in the kind of standards and environments that you're exposed to or not exposed to. And so to me, part of well-being is sort of the kind of environment that we're creating for children to see themselves and to see that who they are matters, whether because of their race or because of their gender or because of even their class, right? Like their socioeconomic status or even their language. So for me, part of well-being is knowing that you are being seen fully, not just from like based on one lens, that you're fully seen, but also you're fully sort of elevated and appreciated and valued. We know that for many children of color, Black kids especially, there's a level of anti-Blackness that just exists in our water. And so for a lot of them, we have many evidence to indicate that they really feel that they don't belong, right? That they're not worthy. As early as 3 years old, they're basically being kicked out of schools, right? At 3 years old, 36-month-old. So for me, part of it is sort of the idea of if we want well-being, is not on the backs and the shoulders of children to do that. It's for the adults and the communities and the programs and the services to make sure that they create a condition for well-being. And I'll just say one more thing, the pandemic. I mean, I think in many ways, the pandemic has opened up this whole other door for us to recognize that being well also means a sort of mental health and mental wellness, right? That we all have been sort of being forced to be superwoman or superman and do everything and be everything. But the pandemic has forced us to really, I think, pay attention to each other, those micro communications, how you either talk to somebody or don't talk to somebody, how you decide to either take this extra work or don't take this extra work. So I think there's a level of now mental wellness that's also part of the conversation that we cannot ignore.
Maryam, I want to pop it back to you for a reaction to what Iheoma just said.
Yes, I so appreciate, Iheoma, what you've lifted up, because it's true. I think feeling disconnected or not belonging or not fully seen, I think there's greater research about this that I know about for adults, where having supportive social connections is as good for us as smoking is bad for us. And thinking about that for children, I would venture to say that that's even, you're going to see even a greater that being even a more important determinant of well-being, because we're built to be connected to other people. And if we're not feeling that as children, that sets the stage for so much suffering within childhood and beyond childhood as well. And again, to Ihooma's point regarding the this feeling of needing to be superheroes during the pandemic, and realizing as well that this is just an impossible ask and task, and not feeling a sense of where to turn to for many parents and many educators, has left this sense of despair that I'd say it's still, although many children are back in schools, I'd say that we're still feeling the aftermath of this, and we will for a very long time.
Karen, I'm headed your way in just a sec, but hang on. Sure. I want to stick with this point a sec, because a lot, Maryam, what you had on the screen, those keys to well-being, I might describe as sort of micro things. They're individual things. But what Iheoma was bringing up were macro things. So, and what happens for a person, but let's especially think about a young person and one of your smaller kind of young people as opposed to your bigger kind of young people, when, let's say, people get the memo and paying attention to relationships and all the kind of right micro things, but it exists in the context, a larger context that has some of those elements, sometimes subtle and sometimes not so subtle, that Iheoma is talking about. And so now you have a kid it's confusing. Like, these people seem like they love me, but out there I'm getting different signals that this world isn't really for me. Iheoma, what do you think about this macro and this micro?
So I mean, and I think it's actually a really good way so I think for me, I think people often think that well-being is situated exactly in the individual. And yes, in some cases that is true. Like, yes, people have to sort of have some responsibility, but when we're talking about young children, we know that young children, right, those first few years are critical for their development. And a lot of that is really the environment that happens. And so let me give you like a crystal example of how the macro hits. So I'll talk about myself, for example. When I was a kid, I grew up in Boston, in sort of the lower income projects kind of places, right? So mind you, my mother loved me, right? I'm one of 7 girls. She loved us. She wanted to feed us and all this stuff, right? But we're living in poverty, right? We have to go to food bank, and she's working 3 jobs, right? So she's trying to as a Black woman, there's a lot of other issues that placed her in a position of having to work 3 jobs and still have to struggle, right? Like, a lot of people work 3 jobs and still struggle. And so imagine her being an immigrant woman, and what does that mean? You're trying to get a job that's going to take care of childcare, healthcare, all those different needs. And then when you think about those macro issues, and you're trying to sort of create this condition where your child feels loved and connected and seen, and you can check in on them. When you have 3 jobs or multiple jobs and multiple stressors, right? Trying to pay for your rent, trying to put food on the table, trying to pay for healthcare, those are costly, stressful things. And when your body and your mind is trying to deal with economic issues, but also social issues that we know are both, there's racist issues happening, there's sexist issues happening that impacts the opportunities, that eventually filters either directly or indirectly to the children, right? Because then it impacts also where I end up. Do I end up in a safe and healthy environment, or do I end up in an environment that's not as healthy or as safe, that's as nurturing? So the macro issues are always going to be there, but for some people, it's much more toxic and much more dire in many instances. And so then it has, I mean, again, my mother created a loving environment as much as possible, but there are just some things that are heavier for her to carry than it would be for other people. So we can't sort of put it all on kids or all on families to create these things if our communities are doing different policies that don't work, if our environments continue to show the murdering of Black people, for example. Those things actually impact your well-being as a person, from the macro to the micro, right? And they happen over time and all the time. So it's not like a one-off thing. And I think it's important for us to recognize they really function together.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking exactly that as you were saying, because like your mom, somebody could do everything, but your mom's not the only person in the chain here. Like, how about the teacher? What if the teacher's well-being isn't any good? So your mom does everything. Off you go to school, and there's this teacher who's actually overwhelmed, feeling despair, acting out in various ways. So your world gets, you're confused. You're getting mixed messages, and maybe nobody's helping you decode these messages. All right, I want to bring in Karen. I also want to encourage people, if you have questions that are specifically for Maryam, Iheoma, and Karen, let's get some of those questions going now, and we can entertain some of those questions before we even get to your community panel. Karen, in our pre-conversation, as usual, you pushed us to think bigger, and it's not like you're against well-being, but you think well-being is maybe nested in some bigger thing. So talk to us a little about that.
Well, obviously we're not against well-being, but
thank you.
Especially when we look at well-being indicators, which tend to be, as Maryam said, more on economic, physical, et cetera. So you look at the child trends indicators, for example, and that's, are young people dropping out of school? Are they getting pregnant? Are they violent, et cetera? The data that we have that goes into well-being indicators is profoundly negative, things that aren't going well. So the definition that Maryam gave was a really important one, focusing on social emotional well-being, looking at all those components that make you really feel like you are moving forward. What we've done with the SOLD Alliance, the Science Learning and Development Alliance, is really to zoom in on the idea of thriving and flourishing. And Maryam mentioned that well-being is a part of flourishing. Thriving or flourishing puts you into the dynamic space of saying, whatever I have in this mix of whether I'm physically or economically sound, I also have a sense of agency. I feel like I can go out and do things in the world and make a difference. And I have a sense of connectedness. I'm connected to something. I'm grounded. I have a sense of collective identity. I move forward. And those put together really give you meaning and purpose that makes thriving a more dynamic thing. It's not that well-being isn't, but the social emotional definition of well-being is the one that's least measured when you're looking at well-being indices. So first of all, if you look at that idea of thriving as this dynamic process of moving forward, we know that thriving and equity are obviously related. It's harder to move forward when things are against you, as we just described. But we also know that both thriving and equity are connected to the condition. Both of them are connected and linked to the broader conditions. If you're in generally threatening or non-supportive conditions, the collective thriving, and it's important to talk about collective, not just individual, the collective thriving of your group, your community, is going to be lower. And that's going to make it harder for you to thrive. Even if, as just described, your mom is doing everything, if you're in a collective space where thriving isn't happening for a lot of people, it's harder for you to move forward. So we need to pay as much attention to the idea of collective thriving, collective well-being as we do for individuals in order to really move things forward. So I would say that first.
I think that's super powerful and important. I love that comment. Keep going.
Yeah. The second thing that I would say, taking it all the way back from the big macro to the tiny micro, is that sometimes when we talk about these big words like well-being and thriving and equity, we get overwhelmed and think, what do we do to combat this? And what we know from the science of learning and development is that learning and development come from relationships and experiences. They're also, the experiences of learning and development are also cumulative. They add up, and tiny things add up. Yeah. And so I give you an example of the tiniest thing that adds up. I don't have a show of hands and I'm on a cell phone, so I can't see things very well, but I'm not sure how many people have heard of the marshmallow test. It's a classic test done 20, 30 years ago by scientists to sort of test out how early and how much difference there is in young children's ability to sort of self-regulate, for them to have deferred gratification or a sense of self-control. So it's a very simple experiment. You have a child come into a room, there's a table and a chair, there's a marshmallow on a plate. The researcher says, there's a marshmallow on a plate. You can eat it now, or I have to go away for 10 minutes or so. When I come back, if you haven't eaten it, I'll give you another marshmallow. And then they have the camera on, and you see these wonderful shots of kids sitting on their hands and holding their hands and licking the marshmallow and trying to decide whether they're going to eat it. The average time that a kid waits before they eat the marshmallow is about 6 minutes. All right, so you say, this is an example, and then they followed kids along longitudinally, and they found that the kids who waited longer at 5 were more successful in school and more successful as young adults. So a lot says you build this idea of self-control very early. You build that trait very early. Now, 20 years later, somebody comes along and says, there's something else here. She's working at, says the researcher working in a homeless shelter, and she says, there's no kid in this shelter that would leave that marshmallow on the plate. That's not about self-control, that's just about reality. So she designed an experiment that said, before the kid goes into the room with a marshmallow, they're going to say, we're running late, would you like to color? Would you like some crayons and a coloring book? The kid, of course, says yes. The person who's also a researcher goes off, half the time they go off and get a coloring book and bring it back with crayons? Half the time they don't. Simple thing. Person asks you a question, they ask if you want something, half the time they respond, half the time they don't respond. The kid then goes into the marshmallow test. A different researcher says the marshmallow sentence. I'll go away and come back. You can have two if they're still there. What did you find? The kids who had the immediate positive experience, of having somebody they could trust somebody to go away and come back and do what they said they were going to do. Those kids, their average time was 12 minutes. But they waited for the marshmallow. The kid who had the negative experience, 3 minutes average time. That huge difference in what we thought was a static trait because of the immediate experience before it is what we have to take in mind when we use these big words, because in the title of this wonderful session that we're in, you had safety, belonging, well-being, and learning recovery. The reality, and so I'm talking to you about none of those. I'm talking to you about trust and marshmallow. You say, how do those two relate? Well, trust is at the core of all of this. And when we have young people who are in numerous situations in which the adults can't be trusted, that slows down everything. That puts them on the defensive all the time. And so as much as we're concerned about learning, recovery, et cetera, we just have to make sure we're making room and making time for young people to rebuild trusting relationships, especially if there's been any kind of disruption or trauma. They have to rebuild those relationships, and so do the adults.
Yeah, so I was gonna, right, that's where I was gonna go, is like, if you want the kids to trust the adults, then that takes us right to thinking about the well-being of those adults. There's the family and caregiver category, but there's also if we think about institutions, there are teachers and educators. So are we paying? And we saw the results of the poll. Like, people don't think we're paying enough attention. So we can have all the right intentions. We can be seeking the right things for young people. And it goes off the rails because we're not tending to the well-being of those educators sufficiently.
And we're not tending to them together. Are we spending enough time helping young people with their relationships? Are we spending enough time? And of course, your poll said no. Are we focusing enough on adult relationships? But we're also not focusing nearly enough on building time and space and supports for relationship building to happen between young people and adults. Yeah. Anytime you go into a classroom or any kind of setting, and the long-term agenda of learning X gets in the way of the short-term agenda of making sure kids feel safe and supported and belonging, you're not going to get to the long-term agenda. And that's why at the Soul Alliance, we developed this thing called the Blue Wheel. It's the design principles, and I think there's a link that'll be dropped in the chat.
We'll put it in.
What we found was that it starts with relationships. You have to have developmentally supportive relationships. Once you have that, kids start to build a sense of safety and belonging. Once they have that, then you can introduce rich instructional experiences, all kinds, academic, non-academic, sports, et cetera, things that challenge young people and want them to grow. Then you specifically talk about the skills that young people are building in those experiences, and you're explicit about them. You're building self-management, you're building self-regulation skills, you're building teamwork, you name the skills that they're building and the knowledge, and then we make sure that there are supportive services if needed. That wheel of 5 things has to be in every environment for it to be optimal learning environment. Everybody doesn't have to focus on the same thing equally, but they all have to be there.
Yeah, I agree. So I want to do 2 things, and then I want to go to invite our community panel to join us. One is I want to ask Iheoma and Maryam whether you have any reactions or extensions on what Karen just said.
Yeah, if I can say a couple of things, I do actually, I was taking copious notes. One is, I really do think it is important for us to think about Thrive, in particular for children's learning, because if you look at a lot of the narrative out there, it's like, oh my goodness, children are pretty much dumbed down and all this. And I'm like, in the end of it, we have to take a different approach to what do we call is learning, right? Because I would argue a lot of kids were learning in many of our public schools were not at the level that I would want my kids to know. So I think we need to kind of add to expand the idea of thriving and flourishing. What does that look like and really mean in our sort of global assessments? I think that's something really important that I often talk about, or at least when I talk about Black children and the ability to still thrive, even under a condition that does not really actually like their being. The second thing I would actually flag is when you go to the work, Karen, that you are referencing, your team has done the essential guiding principles for whole child design. It sounds a lot like what I would see in Montessori's, for example, right? If you think about Montessori programming, you'll see a lot of that. Like that's what you see, and I think when you go back and look at why is Montessori not an approach that is part of our public sector, it will sort of say there's a lot of questions that we should all ask ourselves. Why is it only available, particularly for higher income, primarily white people, when there's certain approaches that we know actually are very much whole child centered, and I think really meet the full emotional, spiritual, and agency of children. So I'll just pause there, but I want to say I really ditto all that you said.
Great. And Maryam, thoughts on what Karen or Iheoma said?
Yeah, I just want to echo the need to consider collective flourishing as we approach this work. There is a focus often on individual well-being. Thinking about sort of one of the core beliefs of the Greater Good Science Center is that, individual well-being promotes social well-being, but social well-being promotes individual well-being. So you have to kind of continue to think of that reciprocity. And that as a society as a whole, we can provide science-based information and tools and skills that help people that are directly responsible for shaping the well-being of others, like school leaders and administrators, that this science is so compelling and so after so many years of accumulating this research base about its importance, that we need to authentically try to do this work, not as one-off kinds of efforts, but think about them as an institution, think about it more globally for all of the folks that are a part of the communities that we're in.
Yeah, I love that. This thing about individual well-being and thriving and collective. It reminds me of a great quote from my former bosses, the Powells, General Powell and Alma Powell, who wrote a few years ago that, of course, there are individual examples of people who succeed against all odds, but as a child, you shouldn't be expected to be a hero to succeed. It's just a ridiculous notion. And you think about kids who are fortunate enough to grow up in, really well-off and high-functioning communities. Of course, what they're surrounded with is all kinds of collective thriving. So even if they're struggling, they're in an environment that's basically supporting and inviting them to thrive, whereas others may be in environments where all the signals are negative. We have one question that I want to pose, and then we're going to go to the community panel for a little while, which is around parenting. And Maryam, I'm going to start with you, but I know that our other guests also have thoughts about how, and Iheoma, you talked about it, how the situation of parents influences the opportunities and well-being for kids, and what we can do to attend to parent well-being, what our friend who runs the campaign, Ralph, calls de-stressing parents, so that they're in a position in which they can, not every parent is going to be the hero that Iheoma's mother was, and we're not going to condemn them for that, but how can we actually put them in a position to be in the best position to help their kids? Maryam, go ahead.
Yeah, I love this question, John, and it reminds me of an interview I did with a researcher, Sunia Luther, who was one of the key researchers who contributed to the National Institutes of Health report on thriving in childhood. And she talked about how there's this sense of toxic positivity where parents are being told to engage in self-care, and as if that is going to help remedy the ills that parents face. And it's insulting at best, and at worst, it's just again an impossible ask of parents in um, who are suffering and in deep despair, that you know thinking. She uses this analogy of putting the oxygen mask on yourself as being fraught. We need to, she says, we need to put, someone needs to be there to put the oxygen mask on you as a parent. And that comes from a community that recognizes and honors what parenting entails. Because oftentimes the onus is on the parents, who are often depleted already. So thinking about what is the community doing to have the oxygen mask at the ready for the parents who are needing support.
Yeah, that's somebody just commented in the chat, and think that for teachers as well. So I'm going to put a pause in this and thank you all. Don't go far, but go off screen and go on mute for a second. And I'm going to invite Beth and Kate and Liz to join us, because what we're going to do now is we're going to have an opportunity to hear live what some people in some of our GLR communities are doing to respond to exactly the kind of impulses that we're hearing. Kate, let's start with you. In Omaha, what are you doing to ensure that there's a real focus on the well-being of students when there's pushback from teachers and administrators who might think this is too, it's too soft, it's too squishy? What are you doing in Omaha around that?
Yeah, I like to say that I keep Dory and Finding Nemo in mind, and I just keep swimming. Yeah, so it's been called squishy and soft. And if we're talking about compassion fatigue with teachers, that's admiring the problem. So what we did when I was a school administrator is we just immersed ourselves in trauma-informed training. We attempted to shift our focus from reacting to responding, asking those questions, what has happened, not what is wrong. We changed our building culture. We used Joseph Murphy's Building Productive Schools information, which is where you say, rigor is important, relationships are important, but if you don't start with relationships, you will never get to the rigor. We also had a staff sort of self-care thing. We had many accidents in our building, minor accidents, but enough to get the attention of the district, and they say, work on it. And so we had some safety as a frame of mind, get the picture. We had a blog, we had silly pictures of us standing on the right kind of ladder and those sort of things. But we started taking care of each other better as a staff, and took all those kinds of trainings in trauma-informed care. And I brought that with me to raise me to read in screening the documentary Resilience, which we did in my school, and we are continuing to do in our community, to sort of set that baseline of understanding in our community that it's a great thing that we pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, but there's so many other layers before that has to happen that enable you to do that. And so we've screened that across our community. We got 300 individuals now, and we have a hospital system that's having us review that documentary Resilience by Jamie Redford, and just think about how you apply that to other situations. And the other aspect that I've been thinking of, because we're working on a playful learning landscape, is just that focus of the benefits of play are in learning also, but they're definitely in mental health and getting outdoors and that parent-child interaction, which our campaign so desperately seeks to encourage.
It's Kate, I'm going to come to the other two of you in just a second, but we have been, because we're rightly frustrated with how learning is going, how fast acceleration is going. Our answer, at least for too much of the last 2-3 decades has been just turn up this one dial on rigor, and maybe a lot of testing too. And I don't want to be against the rigor part. Like, I do really want kids to learn how to read. I want them to learn how to do math and be curious and all those things. But we forgot about this other dial. And if you just turn the volume up on rigor and never think about, is this working? Of course, it'll work for some students, but some students, it'll be distancing and we're not attending enough to their well-being. So I love the way that you're thinking about these two things together.
If you think of it as 50-50, I think that helps you. It helps anybody that's not willing to listen to that concept. But if you say, yes, rigor's there, and we have that in our schools, we have that in our schools. We have teachers who are marvelous, who understand their curriculum, who know how to run a classroom. They're there, they're ready. But there's that whole, like you just said, John, that whole other piece that is the relationship between the staff and one another, between the staff and the students, and then what others were talking about today too, in that community piece, that we're connecting with parents too, and we understand what they're going through, and that we are partners in this. We are not the experts. We are the partners, and it is really hard to shift that. And I understand that too, for educators and administrators, because they're graded on the test scores. So it's a very hard hill to climb.
It is, and it seems like not if your destination is test scores, and I subscribe to the destination that demonstrates academic achievement. It seems like the long way around. I actually think it's the shorter way, is to go through well-being and all of these factors, but it doesn't seem like the direct route. And people just think, the one dial, let's turn up the rigor and have longer classes and longer school days and so forth. All right, Kate, thanks so much. We're going to come back to you. Beth, I love the name of your initiative, Resilient Lehigh Valley. And maybe you should say a little bit about the Lehigh Valley before we get into what your initiative is about, because as I said to you when we talked before, I was there talking to recent high school graduates, and I just want to give people a picture of what's going on in the Lehigh Valley and what are we talked about these macro challenges. What are the macro challenges that you're facing in the Lehigh Valley?
Well, I'll just say, I don't think the challenges we're seeing in the Lehigh Valley are any different than any of our other communities. We're 2 counties. We're about an hour outside of Philadelphia, an hour shy of the Poconos. But we've got some urban areas, suburban, and rural areas, so pretty diverse community. Our largest urban area is Allentown. That school district was closed and virtual only for about 18 months. Really started with like 0 devices for kids, and the gang recruitment and gang activity and community violence pre-COVID was a problem. Post-COVID and during COVID just really exacerbated. As a community, in terms of youth mental health, this is the older kids, but I think reflects on the younger kids as well. About 4 in 10 Lehigh Valley preteens and teens report feeling sad or depressed most days in the last 12 months. And you've seen the rates of self-harming and suicidal thoughts really skyrocket between 2019 and 2021. So we know nationally and locally we're in a youth mental health crisis, and depending on the communities you're serving, right, and the resources they have and the levels of community trauma and homelessness, housing insecurity and gang activity. Not all of our kids fared the same. Not all of our kids had the same home and neighborhood environments, over the last 2 years. So,
and a lot for teachers and educators to deal with too, right? So, there's all that, and then okay. So tell us about Resilient Lehigh Valley out of the United Way. I want to, definitely. Put that in. It's a United Way initiative. So go ahead.
Yes. So I work for United Way of Greater Lehigh Valley, one of many across the country. And United Ways in general are kind of community mobilizers and conveners and advocates. So we had already launched our own third grade reading campaign, and we're part of the national campaign for grade level reading called LV Reads. Through our work in education, we really had identified early on the impact of trauma on our schools, not only for our children, our families, but also our school staff. And that was where we were doing pre-COVID. And so that really inspired us to launch Resilient Lehigh Valley. So that is a kind of community-driven collective impact effort to promote hope, healing, and flourishing for youth, families, and communities in the Lehigh Valley through advancing trauma-informed and culture-responsive practices and systems kind of writ large. But we've been doing a lot in our school space. So kind of building on what Kate was saying, we've been really working, training staff around trauma-informed and culture-responsive school model. And just kind of language that I think it ties in the trauma-informed school to what the speakers were saying earlier. The core values of a trauma-informed school: safety, collaboration, empowerment, trustworthiness, and choice. So think of a learning environment that is fostering those 5 things and how children were fair.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of those, a
welfare.
lot of the things that were on Maryam's chart are
Yeah.
reflected in those 5 things, right?
Yeah, so it really is, yes, training on trauma and trauma's impact on the brain and signs and symptoms of trauma, trauma-informed practices, trauma-informed de-escalation, like yes to those things, like that's a key piece of it. But fundamentally, it's building a sense of emotional and physical safety for everybody, students and staff and families that engage. Really focusing on collaboration, right? No one has the answer. We all have our own truth. Really empowering folks, right? Building a sense of agency. Which leads to flourishing and thriving, right? The Karen was speaking to. Trustworthiness, right? If you say you're going to do something, you follow through, right? I'm not going to feel emotionally safe, right? If I don't trust the others around us. And choice.
Yeah, just what Karen was talking about in the second marshmallow test. Go ahead, and choice.
So I'm just saying, so to me, kind of that connection from what Karen and Maryam were talking about earlier segues nicely into some of what Kate and I are doing around really promoting and advocating this trauma-informed and culture-responsive learning environment for our kids, right? Along those core factors, and how that shapes up kind of practically. We started that work with a strong focus on staff wellness, right? Knowing pre-COVID our staff, especially in our high poverty schools, were already pretty burnt out, right? So really working with them and listen to them and collaborating with them and building their agency, voice, and choice. And like, what is helpful? What is the environment that you want to see in your school? So we developed things like peace rooms or Zen rooms for staff, transforming the school faculty lounge really into this mindfulness, relaxing space. And one of the rules is when you walk into that staff Zen peace room, you put your phone in a basket. Because usually the phone is a stressor. And rule number 2, you're not talking about students, because that's another stressor, right? And different things like that. So really focusing on staff wellness. Another strategy was tap in, tap out. Right. So really kind of restructuring some of the staffing, especially some of those free staff, that aren't tied to a classroom. So if I'm, as a teacher, I'm getting emotionally dysregulated, which happens, we're human, right? I can call down, to this hotline number, or I can call down the principal, and I have permission and I am encouraged to use this, right? Well, someone will take over my class, give me 5-10 minutes, coffee, Zen, peace room, walk, I come back, right? So there's some really practical things like that really help foster staff wellness. And the research is overwhelming. When we really invest in educator wellness, you see a direct tie-in to the relationships, the safe and supportive nurturing relationships, and also, improve social emotional wellness for kids, and then improved academics.
Hey, Beth, hang on one sec. Matt asked in the chat, could you, like, with your fingers, the five things? Matt wants to write them down. So
sure. And I'll put them in the chat too.
Okay,
Safety,
great.
Collaboration, empowerment, trustworthiness, and choice. And there are free online trauma-informed school training resources. I know we'll drop those in the chat as well. So if you don't have someone in your community that can do that, there's some national resources. We have some Pennsylvania resources as well. So there's a lot of free training out there on this too.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So Liz, I want to invite you into this conversation because you've been thinking about exactly what Beth has been talking about. So tell us a little about what you're up to in Indian River.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Boy, I could just say ditto to everything that everybody else has said. What can I add to that? I can tell you that the Learning Alliance started 12 years ago, and by two moms. I am one of them. And I always say two crazy moms and a philanthropist. You know, we started this organization. Our kids were struggling in school. My son was 9 and he was a non-reader. And when you're a non-reader at 9, does become a mental health issue. We had anxiety, depression, school refusal, you name it. And there was not a lot of well-being coming out of my as a parent from me in those times. But we did have the resources, to the point made earlier, to we, out of desperation, we left our town here and went to Baltimore, where I'm from, put both of my boys in schools for kids with language and learning disabilities. And in 2 years, the gaps were closed. So I went back to graduate school and immersed myself in these schools and really wanted to learn what is going on here. And there's at a very simple level, it's what everybody has said. They address two sides of the coin. One is academics, but the other is well-being. They took them both very seriously and built my boys back up to the point that they closed academic gaps, but they were strong, competent, capable human beings. They worked with the parents. So then and I've taught in Montessori schools as well. So then the question becomes, what do you take from that? Like, why is that information and that way of learning really only available to a certain subset of students? How do you take what we know the research supports and take it out to the greater system? How do you institutionalize that? So that was really the question that launched me as the director of professional development in our organization. And I can tell you, you can, but it looks different. So that's just a little backstory on us. We do, as an organization, do lots of work with parents and families and community partners and creating this whole ecosystem around this 90% goal. But our goal kind of is stayed the same. But the question that we are all asking in the community is, what does it take to create literate, compassionate, creative citizens who will improve our world? So when you throw a question like that out into the universe and attached to this 90% literacy goal, you have to reimagine kind of how we are all going to interact with each other and how we are all going to create that environment for our youngest citizens. When I start much of my training, I really start, my first opening slide is this idea that learning is a connection project. And when we look at the research on high school dropouts, the kids will say it's a lack of connection, lack of connection to each other, to the material being taught, to the educators in front of them. So if, in the essence, if learning is a connection project, how are we creating experiences where educators are connected to each other, kids are connected to the adults in front of them, and the kids are connected to each other, I don't know if I said that, and to the material. I also see a lack of connection to the material. To your point, it's we have to reach this goal. We have to get them through this academic material, but it's meaningless. So, what I see, and I am embedded in the trenches now in a school. What I see, like I said on our last week. The modern student, post-COVID student, I'm living everything that was mentioned, really struggles with self-regulation to an extreme point. I'm 12 years into this work. Attention, real struggles there. They struggle with interpersonal relationships. So that real lack of communication skills, that real lack of connectivity is so critical, and we have to step back and say, okay, what are the structures, rituals, routines we're going to put in place to ensure that we can, grow those relationships, make those connections, and help the kids give language to it. This lack of interaction I've never seen kids so unable to socially interact ever. And it's
I was just, yeah, I mean, that's super disconcerting. I was just hearing the same from somebody who's got an 8th grader who was completely disrupted from 8th grade through from 6th grade through 8th grade, and now is just really at sea about what does it mean to be in this group environment. You know, when you talk about learning as a connection thing, and I know Karen's cheering when you say that, that it's particularly true because like what we learn in school today is different. It's more process than it is, you know, specific facts, right? It's the ability to learn things because unlike, at least when I went to school, when we were supposed to memorize a bunch of stuff, you can look up all that stuff, right? So it's not about, it's about how you navigate in the world and discover the things that you need to discover and work with people to create things. So I think that was really good. I'd like to hear from you, and then I'm going to invite Karen and Maryam and Iheoma to rejoin us. Results. How do you, I love the impulses that you're bringing into your community and what you're trying to make happen. And I'm curious, results sort of in 2 dimensions. You talked about this a little bit, Kate, resistance or acceptance or, you know, embrace. How are people reacting and experiencing this? And do you see early signs that this is quote unquote working? Or what are the signs that suggest to you that this is working? So Beth, I'll come to you, and then Kate, I'll come to you next.
You want me to answer that first?
No, I'll come to you. I'm giving you a rest for a second, Liz.
Okay, good.
Yeah, you can catch your breath for a second and collect your thoughts. Beth, what's your sense of, you know, how people are reacting to what you're trying to do? And do you see signs of success that tell you, yes, more of this? This is working for kids, or this is working for educators or for the community. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we were fortunate that we started this work pre-COVID and already had piloted a trauma-informed school in some of our higher needs schools and got buy-in with one of our leading superintendents. I think once you get a top dog that's really respected in your community, that really helps,
Sure.
you know, to get leaders to think differently. So we were kind of intentional with where we piloted. But I'll say with the schools that have really embraced a trauma-informed school model, we are already, and this was pre-COVID, but is still true post-COVID. The suspension rates and office discipline rates were cut in like half, or in some schools by like 70% within like 2 years. Like a year of training and a year of doing, and significantly reduced.
Okay,
right?
that's
I think
real.
that's called the prison pipeline. It's effective there. And also, you know, chronic absenteeism reduced, and even saw improvements, significant marked improvements in academics. So, you know, that also a goal of, you know, the academic goal that everyone has in mind, it actually works. So, you know, we can prove, hey, if you put time here, you will see what you want to see, and you'll have, you know, calmer classrooms everyone wants, but really more peaceful, more supportive, more nurturing, where more learning can happen, classrooms that helps get to that. We also improvements in staff culture, staff morale. Post-COVID, interestingly enough, our schools that were trauma-informed schools pre-COVID, they didn't lose any staff post-COVID. You know, when you see this exodus of educators leaving, our trauma-informed schools that really were focusing on those 5 core values and that safe, supporting learning environment, even for the adults, they maintain their staff, right? Because the school was focused on the staff wellness and supported staff wellness through. So some really good data, I think, that this really does work.
Very powerful. Kate, you're seeing similar kinds of outcomes?
No, not yet.
Thank you for being honest about that.
We are a little bit. In our school, I loved that idea of relationship and having that one person to go to. And for our high chronic absent kids, we established mentors, and all that was a check-in with the person at the beginning of the day. And even our extras, so it was all staff that weren't classroom teachers. And even our staff that were traveling staff, they had it set up so that kids knew they still had to go check in somehow. And it was 100% effective. And the thing that we found out was, like, we had these big, oh, you got done. And the person, whoever was their mentor, you know, when they were all right back on track, as soon as we let go of that mentor, our students' attendance went declined again. So we learned that that mentors work, and just that one extra person in the building that knows you're here, that's a value to kids. Another aspect that's changed since the pandemic is that my backbone, the Metropolitan Omaha Educational Consortium. So that's a consortium of all the superintendents in our three county area. They have prioritized mental health. There's a huge group that's meeting on this, that are having action steps. There was a graduate student who is working on a master's degree and did some work with that in that realm too. So it's gotten the attention post-pandemic of those big guys, as Beth said, the leaders. And the last thing I would say is just creating that Karen said is creating that time and space to build relationships. And as Beth said, it's going to pay back in the end. And penultimate, second to last thing is, if you build it, they will come. You know, the things will come if you build it. And we've got to just make that shift.
Great. Liz, get a quick response from you. And then while you're talking, I'm going to invite our experts to rejoin us. And I'm going to once again call for any questions that people in the audience have that they'd like to hear explored. Reactions to and evidence of effectiveness to date.
So I would say the educators that we've worked with have stayed, to the point made earlier, to Beth's point, they have stayed in the system. We all rode out COVID together. The idea is we're all in this together. Let's roll up our sleeves and work together as a team and learn our way through this. They stayed, and they are committed. The educators that are either new to the system or are not quite in that fold are much more fragile, to Beth's point. So I'm in a school, and it's going to become next year probably a community school, a public-private partnership lab school. So we can really try to drill down around all of these things we're talking about and get really intentional and be able to showcase and share. But it'll be an educator training hub, so they would come here, get trained, and then go out into the system. So I don't have those comprehensive results. I can tell you from what we were at 60% on our scores for reading by the end of third grade. We held that 60% through the pandemic. This past year, we dropped to 58%. But we rose 12 to the state, up 12 rankings in the state. So I think what we need to do a better job is saying, hey, these scores are moving. But we need to do a better job of gathering the data around what are the things, what is the ecosystem that's being created, and how do we accelerate that work. And I'm part of an acceleration team in a school that is asking these very same questions. So hopefully one day we'll get back on and have results like Beth has.
Awesome. That's great. Again, I'm going to put out a call, and Emily, I'm putting you on notice around looking for some questions that we should ask everybody. But as you're looking, I just want to bounce back to our expert panel and hear a little bit of your reactions. You just heard three people in very different communities who are working on these exact issues on the ground. Reactions. Maryam, start with you.
Yeah, I'm so heartened and inspired by what Beth and Liz and Kate presented. And I think, I was thinking back to some of the science that I have been reviewing. And one of the researchers that I looked at recently had an opportunity to do large-scale implementation of well-being for educators across 3 very different settings. One was in Bhutan, which is a small country in the Himalayas. another in Jalisco, Mexico, a large state in Mexico, and in Peru. And they focused on implementing a well-being intervention for educators primarily across a year. And then they looked at outcomes later on and found that because of this focus on well-being, they were able, I mean, well-being in itself, to improve well-being as an outcome is extremely important and impressive. They also talked about how it also led to greater academic achievement and performance. And
Wow.
they asked why. And the variables that they found that were most important is that well-being nurtured better learners because they all have a sense of connectedness. They're more engaged and they persevere. And to me, that speaks to this idea of, learners feeling safe to try even when it's hard, and educators doing the same as well. So obviously that's so critical for this conversation, but I feel like we've got the science that backs why this is such an important endeavor.
Karen, I know you're thinking some things. I want to hear what your reactions are. Maryam, that was right on time. And when you finished with science, I wanted to jump to the next block because Karen's been working so hard on the science of learning and development.
I
So,
mean,
reactions?
The examples are both heartening and not surprising. And the challenge that we have is that we put them out as bright spot examples, but we don't understand both the connections between what makes those examples successful and the challenges that we have in changing the system.
Yeah.
The system just is not designed to support those examples. The examples are the exception to the rule. They take extraordinary efforts to do that because it's not the way the system was set up. My colleague Tracy has been dropping things madly in the chat, I think, as we've been going along. And that's because over the past 6 months, there have been so many books and reports put out, just basically putting out ways to say, we have to find a way to move from the conventional way that we do education into a completely new form. That's not dismantling public education. It's basically making sure that what we say is mandatory actually matters. Because right now, what is mandatory, what we ask people to do, and they send their kids to school for 8 hours a day, if they have the income, if they have the time, if they have the resources, if they live in an enriched community, that kid comes home from school and actually starts learning or supplements learning in very real ways. They go to after school programs, they go to music, they go to church, they go to all kinds of things. And I've been asking this question to people, adults and kids, for 40, 50 years. Close your eyes and think of the most powerful learning experience you had, and then tell me where it was, who you were with, what it was about, and then tell me why you think it was so powerful.
Yep.
And maybe 15% of those experiences are in school and in a formal classroom. It's not where powerful learning happens. And that's really unfortunate, but it's also by design. Not by design that we wanted to waste kids' time, but because it's so baked into the structure of our education system that we can't change it from inside. And we need to, and the challenge of not changing it from inside is the country is so bought into, for the past century, a narrow definition of what learning is. That's equal to what happens in school, that even though parents can validate the fact that learning happens more naturally and better and more comfortably for their kids often outside of school, they're still uncomfortable bringing that demand to the schools. And so we have an opportunity to rethink this, but we have to come up way up a level and understand that the system isn't built to do it. And that's why some of these things that are being dropped into the chat are so important. There's a piece that just came out yesterday from the Education Reimagined and the Christensen Institute, which is focused on disruptive innovation. And it's a brilliant piece in which there's one chart. I could share my screen with you, which I can't do at the moment. I would show you this one chart. It basically says organizations, including schools, are put together on four pieces. You have a value proposition about why it's there. You have the resources that you have to cobble together to get it going. You have a financial formula that keeps you moving, and you have processes that you put in place to make this stuff work. So value proposition, resources, financial formula, and processes. And he summarizes what the conventional school looks like in this very simple chart. And the first three things in his list are schools, the value proposition of school is we're going to provide universal access to a standard common curriculum. We're going to prepare instruction that's focused on helping kids take standardized tests and assessments. And we're going to provide a reliable mechanism to rank and sort learners for college and career success. His last three bullets are we're going to provide extracurricular activities, and we're going to promote opportunities for young people to make friends. And we're going to train children to comply and be socially responsible. And we're going to provide custodial care for kids. Those are all important, but the resources, the financial formula, and the processes are all designed around the first three bullets. And so what we're talking about when we talk about learner-centered education, we talk about decentralizing things, we talk about all the words that we use, you can't get there because the processes, the financial formula, the resources from the teachers to how the campuses are designed, how the buildings are designed, are all built to support those first three things. And those are the things people are rapidly trying to get rid of, but we can't do it when the whole system is set up the other way. So I could talk more on that, but I will stop. So
Great,
I will say
thanks.
one thing, which is several people mentioned Montessori. And I want to just say really quickly, if there's one book to read, it's called The Future of Smart by Ilka Yossi Hansen. And she basically looks at Montessori and two other methods that were developed around the same time and talks about and explains why those methods, even if they were really developed to be universal, haven't caught on and what we need to do about it. So I'm going to recommend that book as well.
Excellent. We'll put Emily just put a link to that book in the chat. So thanks for that, Emily. Iheoma, I want to come to you for a sec for a reaction, and then Emily, I'm going to turn to you for see if there are questions we want to answer. And we have like 10 minutes left. And Sierra, anytime you want to put up the final poll, we will have it on the screen while we continue to talk. Really encourage people to fill it out. We look at these really carefully, and as I said before, we're involved in a bunch of experiments trying to improve these webinars, and so we need your input. Go ahead.
So I want to just applaud Liz, Beth, and Kate just for the work that they're doing. And for me, when I was listening to them, it sort of reminds me that leadership matters, like across the board, right? If you want to make any kind of sustainable change, you have to have leaders that are grounded, and I would argue issues of equity, issues of child-centered well-being, all of that, communities and culture. I think that that's really important. So I will say leadership clearly mattered to some extent for any of these things to be happening, whether you see evidence of it right now or you eventually will later on down the line. And I think that also means because they're creating a level of stability in many regards. But I would probably boil it down into three P's. One is, I think leadership and commitment means that you feel protected. The adults feel protected, the children feel protected, the families feel like that whatever the issues are, we can talk about and deal with them in ways that is conducive to actually problem solving. So like the idea of full physical, social, psychological, spiritual protection is there. I think that's what I'm hearing. The second is, Ryan, the idea of promotion, right? That there seems like the schools, the community, the leadership really created a level of promotion of health and well-being across the board. It wasn't like a one-off kind of thing, but something that was fully integrated in aspects of the programming, of the systems, in conversations, that it really was, we actually expect this. And so we are going to create the condition to have that happen. And of course, my last piece around preservation. How do we make sure that we're preserving the best of the best, even in the middle of a pandemic, right? So I think that there was a level of leadership that really thought about sort of the protection of people, the promotion of preservation. And I would say, especially when I think about all this work, to me, is very much what we know happens globally. In many other countries, the idea of sort of coming together, dealing with whether it's mass, wars and so many other things is probably bigger in other countries than it is in the US. The idea of community to me is what I keep hearing come forth, whether it's collectiveness or community. I think in the end of it, we have a time and a moment to sort of get away from some of this tribalism, this idea of individualistic meritocracy, the things that actually don't exist. in reality, right? I think that we have to begin to really lean into each other, because I think in the end of it, if we want children to really be healthy, to really be thriving, I think it's a reminder that they cannot do that in a vacuum. They cannot do that in their rooms, in their own spaces. That they need the community, and the community includes policy. I think that we cannot I think to Karen's point, we can have shiny, bright spots, but we have to have our policies actually have to work for us, right? Work for families, work for schools and learning spaces. There's a reason why Black people in particular are leaving public spaces and public schools, because they never work for them. And now that they're like, you know what? I don't need to deal with all of these stressors that is literally killing me and likely gonna kill my babies. Right. So I think we have to look at what's happening to say, how do we address policies, both big P policies and little P policies, to really make learning spaces transformative, to be healing. And I think to what Beth and Liz and Kate were talking about, to be trauma informed, but really healing. To me, if you're not a healing space, it's not a learning space. And I think we have to kind of push our systems, our standards and assessments to begin to assess those things. Don't assess my reading and math if I have not been able to assess the extent to which you are actually healing me as opposed to harming me. Right now, many public schools are harming children, particularly Black and brown children, children who have disabilities and other kinds of marginal identities. If we continue to harm children, the fact that we're looking at the scores right now is like, yeah, that's evidence that something is wrong, not with the kids, but with us adults and the systems that we have created, or the lack of policies that are transformative and progressive for our children. We can't expect some brilliance to happen if our policies literally continue to say, children, you are not important. Childcare, you're not important. Teachers, you're not important. If we keep sending messages about the lack of value of children and those who care and love and teach them, then why do we expect something different, right? So we have to ask our policymakers to do something different, right? And not sort of hope and pray for it.
Awesome. Thank you. That was great. Really great. Emily, are there any questions from the Q&A box that you want to pose up to the crew?
So, it's interesting. There really aren't that many questions. So I think it's great that we continue the conversation and the discussion, which has been awesome. And also Kate and Beth have both responded to some important questions, which I'm tempted to bring up. I figure, why don't we go with one of the ones that has yet to be answered, which is really talking about, and this is from an anonymous attendee, the depth of trauma related to homelessness, related to, not having a permanent residence, related to experiencing high murder rates in their city. What can schools do to counter this major sort of impact of trauma? And I know you've touched on it, but I think it's just kind of that specificness of like homelessness, high murder rates, like when kids are experiencing this on a day-to-day basis, how do you manage that?
Yeah, well, that's a hard question. Who wants to go ahead?
I'll offer a very small but successful answer to that question.
Yep.
Which is, there's a program that's called Handle with Care.
Yep.
It's set up by first responders. It doesn't solve the problem, but it shows us again how small things can make a big difference. So when that young person leaves school, nobody knows what they go back to, even if they're not homeless and moving around. Nobody knows what happens. But first responders often know when a child was involved in some kind of traumatic incident, whether it was a domestic violence, they were evicted, whatever, something happened. And this is a very simple mechanism where a first responder, if they see a child on the site, they ask the child if they're all right, they ask them who they are, they ask them what school they go to. They don't share what the incident was, they just share that information with their dispatcher, who puts it into a form that's sent out to those schools that just says, handle with care. In other words, something traumatic happened to this kid, handle them with care. That system, coupled with basic training for staff, has produced incredible results just because it alerts. And that's the main thing that schools have to do. First of all, just acknowledge that school is a small part of kids' lives, and either good things or bad things that happen outside will come in. And you can either ignore them or you can assume that that's happening, and you can really ask about it. That's the first thing you do.
Was it Beth or Kate? I can't remember. One of you said, Beth, you guys did the Handle with Care?
Yeah, and thanks for that shout out, Karen. We're doing a Hand with Care program in our 2 counties and trying to get a statewide effort. And we've already seen 800 Hand with Care referrals, and it really gives schools that early heads up. But the caveat with Hand with Care is the school needs to respond in trauma-informed ways.
That's right. That's right.
So it
Exactly.
kind of segues into that. The other thing, and I know we're kind of at time.
Right at time. Yeah.
Is
Go ahead.
just another thing on this. We are also leading a community school effort in our community, and there's tons of models. There's a whole national coalition for community schools that has great resources, and happy to talk offline anybody about that. But that is really dedicated community school staffing, food pantry, helping to make those housing referrals, helping to connect kids with behavioral health resources or bring in extra resources or mentors, engaging faith community and business community and tutors and higher eds, and really coordinate all of that. We found great success with that because we locally are seeing a huge, housing crisis in our community, as are many other communities across the country. And so that community school model and infrastructure and trust building and relationship building and resource connection has been really helpful. And we've actually added into that a school-based housing navigator. So like a school-based dedicated person to really help with all the housing resources as well. So that's just another model that schools can connect, and schools can use their Title I, Title IV money for community school staffing. So there's some funding streams open for that too.
Fantastic. I see that we're at time. And I just want to say, I advertised you all as an amazing panel. You delivered and over-delivered. Fantastic. Thrilling to hear these ideas and then hear the actions that are going on. So I want to thank each of our panelists. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. And Sheriff, you want to put up the little screen again with with what's coming up. I hope that folks will continue to join these Learning Tuesday activities. There's going to be one next week about benefiting from public housing partnerships, and then also the following week, right after Thanksgiving, in partnership with the New America Foundation. So thank you all very much for a terrific session. It helped me with despair, I'll tell you that, because I feel energized, full of ideas, and energized by your actions, and I hope others feel the same way. Thanks so much, and have a good afternoon and evening to everybody. So long.